Chapter 1. A Study in Disassembly. The silence that followed the act was absolute. It was a perfect, crystalline silence that seemed to absorb the single, ugly sound that had preceded it. Julian Finch stood over the crumpled form, his breath plumbing in the thin, frigid air. The ice axe in his hand felt less like a tool and more like an extension of his will, a cold, sharp thought given physical form. Marco Benini lay half-submerged in a drift of fresh snow, his bright red parka a violent slash against the world's white canvas. There was no struggle. There was only Marco's brief, confused turn, the widening of his dark eyes, and the wet, percussive impact that had ended the conversation about shutter speeds. Julian did not move for a long time. He listened. The wind sighed down the couloir, a low, mournful note that carried with it the fine-spun dust of ice. No shouts, no calls from a distant trail. He was alone with his work. This was the first, most critical phase, the confirmation of isolation. He had planned the location for weeks, studying satellite imagery and trekking forums. This narrow, forgotten pass was a dead end, a scenic detour no serious climber would take. Marco, with his photographer's eye and his romantic's heart, had been an easy lure. Slowly, Julian crouched. The blood was a surprisingly small amount, a dark, viscous stain spreading from beneath Marco's head. It began to freeze almost immediately, the edges turning brittle and black. He reached out a gloved finger and touched the side of Marco's neck. No pulse. The carotid was a silent, empty vessel. He had practiced the strike on anatomical dummies in his small flat, visualizing the point of impact, the angle, the force required. The reality was messier, but the outcome was the same. A success. He pulled the ice axe free. The motion was clinical, a careful twist to dislodge the pick from bone and brain tissue. He wiped the metal clean on the inside of Marco's own parka, a small, practical desecration that was only the beginning. He laid the axe aside and unclipped the heavy expedition pack from his back. From it, he retrieved a tightly rolled bundle of thick, waterproof canvas and a set of implements wrapped in oilcloth. A butcher's kit. A saw with a fine-toothed blade, a heavy-bladed cleaver, several knives of varying sizes. Each was honed to a razor's edge. He had spent more on them than on his own climbing gear. The wind picked up, a steady, insistent pressure that drove ice crystals against his face. He needed to work efficiently. The cold was a tool, but it was also an enemy. He dragged Marco's body behind a large outcrop of schist, a jagged black rock that offered some protection from the wind, and more importantly, from any imagined eyes on the high ridges. He laid out the canvas sheet, its dark green surface stark against the snow. Then began the second phase, the reduction. He worked with a surgeon's detachment. He had rehearsed this part mentally 1,000 times, clothes first. He unzipped the parka, the fleece, the thermal layers. The pale, cooling skin was a shock against the vibrant colors of the technical fabrics. He folded each garment neatly. He would burn what he could not use. The body itself was a problem of engineering, a problem of volume and weight distribution. He could not carry a whole man on his back. Not convincingly. The small, sharp saw was for the bone. Its sound was the worst part, a grating, rhythmic shriek that set his teeth on edge. It was the only sound that pierced the wind's low hum. He started with the limbs, knees, elbows. The process was physically demanding. His shoulders ached. His breath came in ragged bursts, each one a cloud of steam in the failing light. He focused on the mechanics, on the clean separation of joint and sinew. He imagined he was dismantling a mannequin, a piece of complex machinery whose purpose was now concluded. He could not afford to think of Marco, of the shared coffee that morning, of the man's easy laugh. Marco was gone. This was merely organic matter, cargo. He wrapped each section in its own smaller canvas bag, cinching the drawstrings tight. The torso was the most difficult, the ribs, the spine. The heavy cleaver was necessary here. Its impacts were dull, solid thuds that vibrated up his arm. He felt a bead of sweat trace a cold line down his spine, despite the biting cold. He paused, resting the cleaver on his thigh, and scanned the jagged horizon. The sun was a smear of orange and purple behind the colossal peaks of the Annapurna Massif. Nothing moved. Only the wind, only the slow, inexorable crawl of the earth's shadow. He had chosen his alias with care. Kenji, a Japanese student of anthropology, quiet, respectful, unobtrusive. His features, a product of a mixed heritage he rarely discussed, were ambiguous enough to allow it. He had practiced the accent, the posture, the specific brand of shy curiosity. He had fabricated university letters, a research proposal. His subject, the cultural and spiritual significance of the Tibetan sky burial. The irony was the point. The whole endeavor was a piece of performance art, a private masterpiece of transgression. Countless murderers sought to hide their work. Julian intended to display his, to have it sanctified and consumed by the very traditions he was studying. He would not just erase Marco, he would elevate his disposal to a sacred act, a perfect, untraceable vanishing. The last part was the head. He could not bring himself to use the saw on the neck. It felt too personal, a line he could not cross. He wrapped it carefully, separately, placing it in the very bottom of his pack, cushioned by Marco's own sleeping bag. He arranged the other parcels around it, balancing the load with the precision of a seasoned alpinist. His pack, a top-of-the-line osprey with an internal frame, was now monstrously heavy. The weight settled onto his hips, a deep, grinding pressure. It was the weight of his secret, the weight of two souls, one living and one packed in pieces. He gathered the blood-stiffened snow in a spare bag. He scraped the rock clean with the edge of a knife. He examined the ground, his eyes missing nothing. A stray fiber from Marco's fleece, a single dark hair. He collected them all. He used a small camp stove to burn Marco's wallet and papers, watching the plastic of the driver's license curl and blacken. The ashes he scattered, letting the wind take them. When he was done, the site was almost pristine. The sun had vanished, leaving a bruised indigo twilight. The stars began to appear, cold and diamond-hard in the high-altitude clarity. He shouldered the immense pack, grunting with the effort. The straps bit into his shoulders. He stood for a moment, letting his body adjust to the burden. He looked towards the path that would lead him down, towards the village of Manning, towards the grieving family he had identified and chosen as his unwitting accomplices. He took a final look at the space behind the rock. It was empty, clean. Nothing remained of Marco Benini. Nothing but the terrible weight on Julian's back and the faint, grating echo of a saw on bone, a sound he suspected the wind would carry for a long, long time. He turned and began the slow, careful descent. He was no longer Julian Finch, the dismissed technician. He was Kenji, and his pilgrimage had just begun. Chapter 2: The Path of Whispers. The trail down from the pass was a treacherous ribbon of ice and scree. Julian moved with the deliberate, energy-conserving pace of a man who understood the mountains. Each step was a calculation. A slip would be disastrous, not merely for his own safety, but for the integrity of his cargo. The pack was a living thing on his back, shifting its weight unpredictably. He imagined the canvas sacks rubbing against each other, a soft, gruesome friction. He forced the thought away. He needed to focus. He walked for 2 days, sleeping in a one-man tent pitched in the scant shelter of rock formations. He ate cold protein bars and drank metallic-tasting water from his flask. He saw no one. The isolation was a comfort, a thick blanket of security. But as he descended, the landscape began to soften. The harsh rock gave way to stunted juniper bushes and the occasional hardy birch. He knew he was re-entering the world of the living. It happened on the 3rd day, just outside the village of Braga. He rounded a bend in the trail, his gaze fixed on the placement of his feet, and almost collided with a small procession moving slowly up the path. An old woman, her face a beautiful ruin of wrinkles, was being carried in a makeshift litter by 2 sturdy, stone-faced men. Following them were a man and a woman, their steps heavy with a sorrow that seemed to hang in the air around them. Julian stepped off the trail immediately, bowing his head in a gesture of respect he had practiced. The man leading the group stopped. He was in his 40s with a broad, weathered face and the steady, assessing eyes of a guide. He wore a heavy wool jacket and hiking boots that had seen years of service. "Namaste," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Namaste," Julian replied, his own voice sounding thin and foreign. This was it, the first test. "I hope I am not in your way." The man, Tenzin, gave a slow shake of his head. "The path is for everyone." His gaze lingered on Julian's enormous pack. It was a look Julian had anticipated, and he had his answer ready. The woman beside Tenzin stepped forward. She was younger, her face etched with a more immediate, raw grief. This was Lakpa. "You are traveling alone?" she asked. Her English was softer, more melodic than her brother's. "Yes," Julian said, keeping his eyes downcast. "I am a student from Japan, Kenji." He bowed his head again slightly. "I am studying the spiritual traditions of this region, the relationship between the people and the mountains." Lakpa's expression softened with a flicker of interest. "You are an anthropologist." "Yes, a student of anthropology," Julian corrected gently. It was a crucial distinction. A student was humble, ignorant, in need of guidance. A professor was an authority, an object of suspicion. "I am very sorry for your loss," he added, gesturing with his head toward the litter. Tenzin's jaw tightened. "It is my father, Sanam. He was a great man. He will have a great journey." "He is to be given to the sky," Lakpa said. The words were not grim. They were filled with a profound sense of rightness. It is what he wished, to become one with the wind and the vultures, to feed life even in death. This was his opening. "The sky burial," Julian said, his voice barely a whisper. He infused it with a manufactured awe. "It is a tradition of incredible power, a final act of generosity. I have read much, but to understand, to truly understand, one must witness." Lakpa looked at her brother. A silent conversation passed between them. Julian held his breath. He was an unknown element, an intrusion at a time of grief. Tenzin's gaze was hard, analytical. He was weighing Julian, assessing the weight of his pack, the quality of his gear, the sincerity in his voice. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. He willed himself to remain calm, to project an aura of harmless, academic humility. "You travel to the monastery at Gyaru?" Tenzin asked. "Yes, it is my hope to speak with the lamas there, to learn." "We are going there," Lakpa said, her voice gentle but firm. "Our father will rest there for a day before we take him to the plateau. You could walk with us. It is not good to be alone on these paths." Tenzin did not look pleased, but he did not contradict his sister. He gave a curt nod. "The path is the path," he repeated, which seemed to be his form of reluctant agreement. He turned and continued up the trail, the litter-bearers falling in step behind him. Lakpa gave Julian a small, sad smile. "My brother Tenzin, he is protective. His heart is heavy." "Of course," Julian said. "I understand completely. I am grateful for your kindness." He fell into step behind her, keeping a respectful distance. The pack felt heavier than ever, a monstrous secret in the midst of their sacred procession. He was in. The deception had taken root. As they walked, Lakpa spoke of her father, of his life as a farmer and a leader in their community. She spoke of his humor, his strength, the way he could read the weather in the shape of the clouds. Julian listened, nodding, offering quiet words of sympathy. He was a fraud, a parasite clinging to their genuine sorrow. And with every step he took with them, the violation deepened. He could feel Tenzin's occasional glances over his shoulder. They were sharp and questioning. The pack was the main problem. It was too large, too heavy for a solo student carrying academic equipment. He would need to explain it. He began formulating the lie in his mind. Sensitive recording equipment, heavy-duty batteries for the cold, specialized cameras, plausible but thin. It would have to be enough. They walked into the late afternoon, the valley sinking into shadow. The air grew colder. Julian focused on the rhythm of his breathing, on the crunch of his boots on the gravelly path. He was acutely aware of the small, wrapped parcels shifting inside his pack. He imagined he could smell a faint, coppery scent, and his stomach turned. It was just paranoia. The canvas was thick, the wrappings secure. No one could know. "You are cold, Kenji?" Lakpa asked, noticing a slight shiver that ran through him. "The air is thin," he managed, forcing a weak smile. "I am still adjusting." She nodded in understanding. "Soon we will be in Manning, we will have tea, you will be warm." He was not cold. He was terrified. He was walking with the family of a good man, on his way to a holy site to perform a sacred rite. And on his back he carried the desecrated remains of another man, a man whose only crime was being too friendly to a stranger. The path ahead was no longer just a trail of rock and ice. It was a path of whispers, where every gust of wind sounded like a judgment, and every kind word from Lakpa felt like a hot coal against his soul. Chapter 3: The Weight of Two Souls. The village of Manning was a cluster of stone houses and lodges clinging to the mountainside, a last outpost before the high passes. Prayer flags fluttered from every rooftop, their vibrant colors muted in the gray evening light. The air was thick with the smells of wood smoke and roasting barley. Tenzin led their small group to a modest guest house owned by a cousin. The room Julian was given was small and cold, with a wooden cot and a single window that looked out onto the immense, star-dusted face of Gangapurna. He lowered the pack to the floor with a heavy, final thud. The relief was immediate and profound. His shoulders screamed in protest. He arched his back, feeling the vertebrae crackle. For hours he had been a beast of burden, carrying the physical and spiritual weight of his crime. He sat on the edge of the cot, his head in his hands, and listened to the sounds of the guest house, the murmur of voices in the common room, the clatter of pots from the kitchen. He was surrounded by life, yet he had never felt more isolated. His pack sat in the corner like a brooding presence. He could not leave it. He could not let it out of his sight. He imagined a curious porter trying to move it, feeling the unnatural density, the strange, lumpy distribution of its contents. He imagined a dog sniffing at it, whining, scratching at the canvas. Paranoia was a viper, striking from the shadows of his mind. He went to the common room for dinner. It was a warm, smoky space centered around a large iron stove. Trekkers from a dozen different countries were huddled around tables, swapping stories and sipping hot, sweet tea. Julian found a small table in a dark corner, hopping to remain anonymous. It was not to be. Lakpa saw him and waved him over to the large table where her family was gathered. Tenzin, Pema the matriarch, and a few other relatives sat in stoic silence. "Come, Kenji, sit with us," Lakpa insisted. "You are our guest." Julian had no choice. He sat, acutely aware of Tenzin's unblinking stare from across the table. Pema, the old woman, looked at him once, her eyes dark and intelligent, before returning her gaze to the fire. Her silence was more unnerving than any question. "Your pack is very heavy," Tenzin stated. It was not a question. For a student. Here it was, the lie he had prepared. "Ah, yes," Julian said, trying to sound slightly embarrassed. "The equipment I have, special instruments for recording ambient sound, the frequencies of the wind at different altitudes. The university insists on high-fidelity recording, so the batteries are substantial, very heavy." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Perhaps I was too ambitious." Lakpa nodded, her expression full of sympathy. "The mountains demand much." Tenzin was not so easily satisfied. "Sound recordings," he said, his voice flat. He took a long drink of his tea. "The wind has only one song here, a sad one." The conversation died. The meal was a tense affair. Julian ate the stew of potatoes and vegetables, forcing each spoonful past the knot of anxiety in his throat. He answered Lakpa's gentle questions about Japan, inventing a life for himself, a small apartment in Kyoto, quiet parents, a passion for ancient cultures. Each word was a brick in the wall of his deception. Later, a young, wiry man joined their table. He was Dawa, a porter who would be helping carry supplies to the monastery. He was bright-eyed and talkative, a stark contrast to the grieving family. He launched into a story about his last trip, his voice animated. "And the snow was deep up to here," he exclaimed, gesturing to his chest. "We were stuck for 2 days, an expedition from Spain. One of them he got the mountain sickness, the bad kind. His mind went." Dawa leaned in, his voice dropping conspiratorially. He said he saw a man walking on the glacier, a man with no face. He said the man was calling his name. Julian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "It is the mountain," Pema said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was a dry rustle of leaves. "It tests you. It shows you what is inside your own spirit." Her dark eyes settled on Julian. "If your spirit is empty, you see empty things. If it is full of ghosts, you see ghosts." Julian dropped his spoon. It clattered loudly against the wooden bowl. He quickly picked it up, his hand shaking. "I am very tired," he said, standing abruptly. "The altitude, I should rest. Thank you for the meal." He retreated to his room, Pema's words following him. "If it is full of ghosts, you see ghosts." He bolted the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding. The pack in the corner seemed to have grown larger, darker. He felt a sudden, irrational urge to open it, to check on the contents, to make sure nothing had changed. He fought it down. That was madness. Sleep did not come easily. He lay on the cot, fully clothed, listening to the wind howl outside his window. It was no longer a simple movement of air. It had a voice. It scraped at the window frame with long, thin fingers. It whispered a name. Marco. He sat bolt upright, his skin clammy. It was just the wind, just his mind playing tricks. He lay back down, pulling the rough wool blanket up to his chin. The weight of what he had done, of what he was carrying, pressed down on him, heavier than any mountain. He was not just carrying the disassembled body of a man. He was carrying the weight of two souls, Marco's, which he had stolen, and his own, which he had just discovered was a hollow, haunted thing. The next morning they prepared to leave for Gyaru. Julian strapped the pack to his back, the familiar, awful weight settling onto his bones. Dawa, the cheerful porter, hefted his own load of supplies and grinned at Julian. "Heavy load, Kenji-san. You must have rocks in there," he joked. Julian forced a smile that felt like a grimace. "Only books," he lied. As they set out on the trail, Tenzin fell into step beside him. The path was wide enough for two here. "Dawa talks much," Tenzin said quietly, "but he has a good heart, and he knows the mountain. He says a storm is coming, a big one. We must hurry." Tenzin looked at Julian, his gaze direct and penetrating. "This equipment of yours, this sound recording, it is very important to you." "It is my entire project," Julian said, his throat dry. "My reason for being here." "I see," Tenzin said. He said nothing more for a long time, and they walked in a silence that was more unnerving than any conversation. Julian was acutely aware of the man beside him, of his competence, his quiet strength, his deep, unshakable connection to the land Julian was planning to defile. The lie felt thin, fragile, ready to tear apart at any moment, and a storm was coming. Chapter 4: A Stranger's Questions. The tea house at Gyaru was perched on a cliff edge, offering a panoramic, terrifying view of the valley below. It was their last stop before the final, steep ascent to the monastery. The storm Tenzin had predicted was no longer a threat but a reality. The sky had turned a bruised, leaden gray, and the wind had a new, vicious edge to it. The peaks across the valley were already disappearing behind a shifting curtain of snow. Inside, the tea house was crowded and loud. It was a bottleneck, a collection point for every trekker and guide trying to outrun the weather. The air was thick with the steam of brewing tea and the smell of damp wool. Julian, Tenzin, Lakpa, and the rest of their small party found a table near the back. Julian set his pack down with a quiet grunt, propping it carefully against the wall behind him. He never let it lie flat. He couldn't bear the thought of its contents settling in an all-too-human shape. He was sipping the hot, salty butter tea when a loud voice boomed across the room. "Tenzin, you old mountain goat, I thought you'd be halfway to Thorongla by now." Julian's entire body went rigid. He did not need to see the man to know him. The voice was unmistakable, loud, American, brimming with an excess of confidence. It was Gideon Hayes, a mountaineer he and Marco had shared a table with in a village 3 days before the murder. 3 days. A large man with a thick, reddish beard and a brightly colored beanie pushed his way through the crowd. He clapped Tenzin on the shoulder with a heavy hand. "Good to see you, man. Heard about your father, I'm sorry." "Gideon," Tenzin said with a nod. "The mountain calls us home when it is time." Gideon's gaze swept the table. He nodded to Lakpa and the others. Then his eyes landed on Julian. Recognition dawned. "Hey, I know you. You were with Marco, right? The Italian guy, the photographer." Time seemed to slow down. The clamor of the tea house faded to a distant hum. Julian could hear the blood pounding in his ears. This was not a scenario he had planned for. It was a variable he had no control over. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Hello," Julian said, his voice a strained whisper. He cleared his throat. "Yes, we trekked together for a day." "Marco, what a character," Gideon boomed, pulling up a stool. "Told me he was going to find some untouched pass to shoot the sunrise. A real artist, that one. Where is he? Did he get his pictures?" Julian's mind raced, sifting through 100 possible lies, searching for the one that would hold. He took a slow sip of tea to buy himself a second. His hand was shaking so badly he had to use both to steady the cup. Lakpa was watching him, her brow furrowed in concern. Tenzin's eyes were narrowed, his expression unreadable but intense. "He went on ahead," Julian said. The lie felt clumsy, pathetic. "He was a faster walker than me. He wanted to catch the early light from a higher vantage point. We were to meet in Manning, but he was not there." Julian looked down at his cup. "I assumed he found a different route, or a different lodge." "Huh," Gideon said, scratching his beard. "That's weird. He didn't seem like the type to just ditch a partner, seemed pretty solid." He looked at Julian more closely. "You feeling okay, pal? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It is the altitude," Lakpa interjected, her voice soft but protective. "Kenji is not yet accustomed to it." Tenzin said nothing. He just watched Julian, his gaze unwavering. It was the gaze of a man who knew what the mountain could do to people, and it was the gaze of a man who could spot a liar. Julian felt stripped bare, his carefully constructed persona beginning to fray at the seams. "Well, if you see him, tell him Gideon Hayes owes him a beer," Gideon said, seemingly satisfied. He turned his attention back to Tenzin, launching into a story about his own expedition's troubles with a faulty stove. The immediate danger had passed, but the damage was done. The seed of a new, more dangerous suspicion had been planted. Julian risked a glance at Tenzin. The man's face was a mask, but his eyes were still on Julian. He knew. He might not know what, but he knew something was wrong. The story of Marco simply moving on was weak. Two trekkers meeting in this sparse landscape don't just lose each other. They leave messages at lodges. They ask after one another. Julian's failure to do so was a glaring red flag. The storm broke with a roar, the wind slamming against the tea house walls like a physical blow. Snow swirled past the windows in a blinding white chaos. They were trapped here in this crowded room with Gideon Hayes and his inconvenient memories, with Tenzin and his growing doubts. Julian excused himself, claiming he needed air. He went to the small, drafty washroom at the back. He splashed icy water on his face, staring at his reflection in the small, cracked mirror. Gideon's words echoed in his head. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He felt like he was a ghost, a hollow man haunted by the weight on his back and the lies on his tongue. He had to get away from them. He had to get to the monastery. He needed the sterile silence of a private room to shore up the crumbling walls of his deception. But the storm held them fast. He returned to the common room and saw Tenzin speaking quietly with Gideon. Tenzin gestured towards Julian with his head, and Gideon shook his head, a puzzled look on his face. They were talking about him, about his story, about Marco. Julian retreated to his pack, sitting on the floor with his back against it, as if guarding it from the hostile world. He pulled his own beanie down low over his eyes and pretended to sleep. But behind his closed eyelids, all he could see were Marco's dark, surprised eyes in the final second of his life. The weight on his back was no longer just the physical burden of flesh and bone. It was the weight of a name that was now known, a name that was being spoken, a name that would follow him up the mountain and refuse to be silenced. Chapter 5: The Monastery's Gaze. The storm raged for a full day and night, imprisoning them in the smoky confines of the tea house. For Julian, it was a waking nightmare of forced proximity. Every conversation was a potential minefield, every questioning glance from Tenzin a physical blow. Gideon Hayes, thankfully, had found a group of fellow Americans and was occupied with loud stories and games of cards. But the damage was done. The name Marco now hung in the air between Julian and the Dorge family. On the second morning, the wind died down, leaving behind a world transformed. The snow was a thick, pristine blanket over everything, muffling all sound. The sky was a sharp, painful blue. It was time to move. The monastery of Gyaru was a day's hard climb away, and Sanam's body could not wait forever. The trek was brutal. The new snow was knee-deep in places, and every step was a struggle. Julian, burdened by his monstrously heavy pack, fell behind almost immediately. Dawa, the porter, offered to help to take some of his load. "No," Julian said, his voice sharper than he intended. "No, thank you, it is delicate equipment. I must carry it myself." Dawa shrugged, his cheerful demeanor undimmed. "As you wish, Kenji-san. You are a strong man, stronger than you look." The comment was meant as a compliment, but it landed like a stone in Julian's gut. Tenzin, breaking the trail ahead, heard the exchange. He paused and looked back, his eyes lingering on Julian's pack, on the strain evident in his face and the deep grooves the straps cut into his shoulders. The monastery appeared late in the afternoon, a fortress of faith clinging to the mountainside. It was a stark, imposing structure of whitewashed stone and dark wood, its windows like narrow, watchful eyes. Prayer wheels spun ceaselessly in the courtyard, powered by the wind. The only sound was their low, rhythmic creak and the deep, resonant chanting that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the building. As their small procession entered the main gate, two enormous dogs rose from the shadows. They were Tibetan mastiffs, huge and black, with thick manes of fur and lips curled back to reveal yellow teeth. They padded forward, their movements silent and predatory. They sniffed at Tenzin and Lakpa, their plumed tails giving a slow, lazy wag. They ignored Dawa. Then they came to Julian. They stopped. The low growls started deep in their chests, a vibration Julian could feel in the soles of his boots. Their hackles rose. They did not bark. They simply stood, barring his way, their collective gaze one of pure, ancient loathing. Kala Berev, a voice calm and clear, cut through the tension. An old man in the saffron and crimson robes of a lama emerged from a doorway. He was bald and stooped, but his eyes were bright and alert. This was Lama Kelsang, the abbot. "They are not fond of strangers," the Lama said, his voice gentle. He spoke a few quiet words in Tibetan, and the dogs subsided, though they continued to watch Julian, their eyes never leaving him. They lay down by the doorway, a pair of dark, simmering threats. "Lama Kelsang," Tenzin said, bowing his head, "we have brought my father." "Sanam was a good man," the Lama said. "The mountain will welcome him. Bring him to the cold room. He will rest there until the morning." Lakpa introduced Julian. "This is Kenji, a student from Japan. He wishes to learn from you, Lamala." Lama Kelsang's gaze settled on Julian. It was not a suspicious gaze like Tenzin's. It was something far more unnerving. It was a gaze of profound perception, as if he were looking not at Julian's face but through it, at the frantic, ugly thing that resided behind his eyes. "A student of our ways," the Lama mused. "Our ways are simple. Life is a gift. Death is a gift. Generosity is the path between them." He looked at Julian's pack. "You carry a heavy burden for a student." "My equipment," Julian stammered, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "For my research." "Ah, research," the Lama said with a small, enigmatic smile. "There is much to learn on this mountain, and much the mountain can teach." He gestured to a young monk. "Show our guest to a room. He is tired from his journey." The room was a cell. A stone floor, a wooden pallet for a bed, a single, high window slit that looked out onto a sheer drop. The door was heavy wood with an iron bolt. When the young monk left, Julian slid the bolt home. The sound echoed in the tiny space. He was safe. He was secure. He was in a prison of his own making. He slumped against the wall, sliding down to the icy floor. The monastery was not a sanctuary, it was a crucible. The air itself felt heavy with judgment. The chanting of the monks, a constant, low drone, seemed to worm its way into his skull, vibrating with the grating memory of his bone saw. The silent appraisal of Pema, the overt suspicion of Tenzin, the innocent questions of Lakpa, the primeval hatred of the dogs, and the all-seeing calm of the Lama. It was an encircling wall of scrutiny. He looked at the pack. It was the source of it all. this grotesque lump of canvas and flesh and bone. For the first time he felt a flicker of hatred for it, for the object that had been the vessel of his grand artistic statement. The statement felt hollow now, a piece of juvenile sociopathic theater. The reality was this: a cold room, a heavy door, and the crushing weight of imminent discovery. That night's sleep was impossible. The wind at this altitude had a new voice, a high, keening wail that sounded like a woman weeping. The chanting from the main hall never stopped. He lay on the hard pallet, staring into the darkness, and saw a face take shape in the gloom. It was not Marco. It was Nawang, the Rajiapa, the body breaker. He had only seen pictures of the man, but his image was burned into Julian's mind. A strong, impassive face. Hands that knew the heft of a human limb, the resistance of a stubborn joint. Hands that would know, with a single touch, the difference between a body that had surrendered its spirit peacefully and one whose life had been stolen. Julian knew Nawang would arrive in the morning. He would come to prepare Sonam's body for its final journey. He would be here in this monastery, a man whose entire life was an intimate conversation with death. And Julian, the impostor, the fraud, was sleeping just one stone wall away from him, guarding a bag full of lies and butchered flesh. The mountain had him now. It had drawn him in, and the monastery's gaze was upon him, patient and unblinking. Chapter 6. The Arrival of the Rajiapa. The morning broke cold and clear. The storm had scoured the sky, leaving it a deep, merciless blue. From his narrow window, Julian could see the Himalayan peaks etched against the horizon with impossible clarity. The beauty was an insult. It was a pristine stage for a profane play. He had not slept. He had sat on the floor, his back against the cold stone wall, his pack a solid, lumpen presence beside him, and listened to the monastery breathe around him. The pre-dawn chanting began, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the floor, a sound that felt ancient and unknowable. It was the day of the ceremony. He forced himself to move, his joints stiff and protesting. He splashed water on his face from a copper basin. The man in the small, distorted reflection was a stranger. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, dark hollows underneath them. His skin had a gray, unhealthy pallor. He looked haunted, hunted. He looked guilty. He needed to pull himself together to re-inhabit the skin of Kenji, the quiet, respectful student. He took a deep breath, the thin air burning his lungs, and tried to smooth the manic energy from his features. When he unbolted his door and stepped out into the corridor, the monastery was already alive with a quiet, purposeful energy. Monks glided past in their crimson robes, their faces serene. Julian felt like a discordant note in a perfect symphony, a splash of mud on clean silk. He avoided eye contact, keeping his gaze fixed on the floor as he made his way to the small common area where he hoped to find tea. He saw Tenzin and Lakpa first. They were standing with Lama Kelsang in the courtyard, their heads bowed. Pema was there too, a small, solid rock of matriarchal strength. They were discussing the final arrangements. The weather was clear. The path to the plateau would be passable, though difficult. They would leave after the morning meal. As Julian watched from the shadows of a covered walkway, he saw another figure approach the group from the main gate. It was a man, but he seemed more a part of the mountain than a product of a village. He was not tall, but immensely broad, with a power in his shoulders and chest that spoke of a life of physical labor. His head was shaved clean, his face was weathered and browned by a lifetime of sun and wind, and his expression was one of profound, unshakable calm. He carried a heavy canvas roll tied with leather straps. Julian's blood ran cold. He did not need to be told who this was. This was Nawang, the Rajiapa. Nawang greeted the Lama with a respectful bow, his hands pressed together. He spoke to Tenzin and Lakpa in a low, gentle voice. From this distance, Julian could not hear the words, but he saw the effect they had. A measure of peace seemed to settle over Lakpa. Tenzin's shoulders, which had been tight with tension, relaxed slightly. Nawang was not a figure of horror to them. He was a comfort, a necessary and compassionate guide for this final part of the journey. This realization twisted something in Julian's gut. He was the monster here, not the man who worked with the dead. Nawang's gaze swept the courtyard. He had the eyes of a hawk, missing nothing. His eyes passed over Julian, lingered for a fraction of a second, and moved on. It was a casual, dismissive glance, yet it felt like a physical touch, a quick, expert assessment. Julian felt an irrational certainty that Nawang could see the lie in him, could smell the guilt clinging to his clothes. He ducked back into the shadows and made his way to the kitchen, desperate for the anonymity of a simple task like getting tea. The cook, a stout, smiling woman, handed him a steaming cup. As he turned to leave, he found his path blocked. Nawang was standing in the doorway. He had to have moved with absolute silence. "Namaste," Nawang said. His voice was deeper up close, a quiet rumble. "Namaste," Julian replied, his own voice tight. He was trapped. Nawang looked at Julian, his eyes calm but missing nothing. He gestured towards the cup. "The tea is good. It warms the bones." He paused. "You are the student, Kenji." "Yes." "You have come to watch." It was a statement, not a question. "I have come to learn, to understand," Julian corrected, his practiced line sounding hollow even to his own ears. Nawang nodded slowly. "There is little to understand. A body is a vessel. When the spirit has departed, the vessel can still give a gift. It can feed the hungry. It is a simple truth." He looked at Julian's hands, which were trembling slightly, making the tea slosh in the cup. "The air is thin here. It can make a man's spirit light, untethered." The dogs, Kala and Barav, appeared at Nawang's side as if summoned from the earth. They did not growl this time. They simply stood, their massive heads lowered, watching Julian with an unnerving intelligence. "The dogs do not like you," Nawang observed without judgment. "They are good judges of a person's heart. They can sense fear, and they can sense when something is out of place." Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. This was the interrogation, delivered in calm, simple statements. He felt a desperate need to flee, to lock himself in his room until it was all over. I am not used to such large animals," he lied. Nawang almost smiled. "They are part of the mountain, like the wind, like the vultures, like the dead." His gaze flickered towards the corridor that led to Julian's room. "You must carry heavy equipment for your work. Your door was closed so tightly. I passed it this morning. There is a strange stillness about that room." Julian's mind screamed. He knows, he smells it. He can sense the presence of another body. But Nawang's face was unreadable. Was he merely making conversation, or was this a test, a gentle, expert prodding at the edges of Julian's composure? "My equipment is sensitive to dust and drafts," Julian said, the lie tasting foul. "Of course," Nawang said. He gave a slight bow. "I must go now. I must help Sanam prepare for his journey." He turned and walked away, the two great dogs padding silently at his heels. Julian sagged against the doorframe, his legs weak. He was shaking uncontrollably. The encounter had lasted less than a minute, but it had felt like an eternity. Nawang was everything he had feared and more. He was not a brute. He was a priest of the flesh, a man whose senses were attuned to the subtle realities of life and death. Julian looked down at his own hands, a technician's hands, a murderer's hands, and felt a profound sense of inadequacy. He was an amateur playing in a professional's world, and the game was almost over. He retreated to his cell, the Rajyapa's words echoing in his mind. They can sense when something is out of place. Chapter 7. A Conversation in the Cold. Hiding was not an option. Julian understood that with a sickening certainty. To remain locked in his room would be an admission of guilt, a confirmation of the strangeness Nawang had already noted. He had to maintain the fiction of Kenji, the earnest, slightly overwhelmed student. He had to see this through to the end. He spent an hour forcing himself into a state of outward calm, practicing his breathing, rehearsing his lines. He was an actor preparing for the most important role of his life. He found Lakpa in the monastery's small, sparse library, running her fingers over the wood-block printed texts wrapped in silk. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mixture of her own sorrow and a gentle concern for him. "Kenji," she said softly, "I was worried. You looked unwell this morning." "I am sorry," Julian said, bowing his head. "The altitude and the power of this place, it is overwhelming." It was a lie built on a foundation of truth, the most effective kind. "It is a thin place," she agreed, echoing the words he'd heard before. "The veil between worlds is weak here. My father understood that. He said it makes it easier for the soul to find its way." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. "Your research, does it help you understand such things, or does it only measure them?" The question was so pure, so direct, it almost disarmed him. It attempts to document the beliefs," he stammered, "to understand their importance to the culture. The spirit is difficult to measure with instruments." "Perhaps you are using the wrong instruments," she said, not unkindly. She held out a small white silk scarf, a kata. "Lama Kelsang asked me to give this to you, for blessing, for your journey up to the plateau. He said you carry a heavy load and will need the mountain's grace." Julian took the scarf. It was feather-light in his hands, but it felt as if it weighed a ton. It was a token of acceptance, of blessing, a thing of profound purity, and he was going to wrap it around his neck while carrying a dismembered body to a holy site. The sacrilege was so immense it made him feel dizzy. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Please, thank him for me." He fled the library, the scarf clutched in his hand. He needed air, cold, sharp air to clear his head. He went out into the main courtyard. The sun was bright, but the air was biting. And there, near the gate, was Nawang. He was cleaning his tools, not the tools for the ceremony, but simple maintenance tools. He sat on a low stone wall, sharpening a large knife on a wet stone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was a deeply unsettling sound. Julian knew he could not avoid him. To turn and walk away now would be an act of cowardice that would not go unnoticed. He forced his feet to move, walking towards the Rajiapa. Nawang looked up as he approached, his hands never ceasing their work. "Kenji-san, you have received a blessing." He nodded at the kata in Julian's hand. "Yes, Lama Kelsang is very kind." "He is very wise," Nawang corrected gently. "Kindness without wisdom is a weak thing." He set the knife aside and picked up a heavy-bladed cleaver, testing its edge with his thumb. Julian's stomach clenched. It was almost identical to the one in his pack. He sees the burdens people carry, the ones on their backs and the ones in their hearts. Nawang squinted up at Julian, the bright sun making the wrinkles around his eyes more pronounced. "You wish to learn about my work." "I wish to understand its spiritual significance," Julian said. "The spirit is the Lama's work. My work is with the vessel." Nawang laid the cleaver down and wiped his hands on a cloth. "You are from a place where you hide your dead. You put them in boxes and bury them in the ground. You pretend they are only sleeping. It is a lie you tell yourselves to ward off fear." He stood up, and for the first time Julian felt the full force of the man's physical presence. Nawang was solid, rooted to the earth. "Here we tell the truth. The body is meat. It is flesh and bone. To leave it to rot in the ground is a waste. It is selfish. To give it to the sky, to the vultures, that is an act of generosity. It is the last good deed a person can do. Do you understand this with your machines and your books?" I am beginning to," Julian said. "Are you?" Nawang took a step closer. Julian had to fight the urge to step back. "I have prepared many bodies, hundreds, perhaps thousands. Each one tells a story. The hands tell of the work they did. The feet tell of the paths they walked." He tapped his own chest. The bones remember everything. They remember sickness. They remember a fall from a horse 50 years ago. They remember the life that was lived inside them. They do not lie. The words were a hammer blow. The bones do not lie. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. He was looking at a man who could read a skeleton like a book, and he was carrying a butchered man's skeleton on his back. "And a body that has met violence," Nawang continued, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "Its bones scream. The story of its end is written in the fractures, in the marks left by the blade. You cannot hide such a thing. The mountain knows, the sky knows, and the vultures. They are the messengers of the sky. They will not touch a lie." Nawang held Julian's gaze for a long moment. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, profound certainty. He was not accusing Julian. He was teaching him. He was laying out the fundamental truths of his world, truths that Julian was about to violate in the most profound way imaginable. "You should prepare yourself," Nawang said, his voice returning to a normal volume. He turned and picked up his tools. "The climb is steep, and the air on the plateau is very thin. It can make a man see things that are not there, or perhaps it makes him see the things that are." He walked away, leaving Julian standing alone in the courtyard, the kata a white flag of surrender in his trembling hand. The conversation had been a dissection. Nawang had taken him apart piece by piece, without ever laying a hand on him. Julian now understood the true nature of the threat. Nowing did not need to find Marco's body. He just needed to be present when Julian's lie was offered to the sky. The mountain would do the rest. Chapter 8: The Unquiet Dead. The night before the ascent was a new circle of hell. Julian lay on the hard pallet in his cell, the door bolted, the cotta draped over his monstrous pack like a pathetic shroud. Sleep was a distant country he could not reach. The monastery was quieter now. The chanting had ceased, replaced by the omnipresent shrieking voice of the wind. It clawed at the stone walls, seeking entry. He closed his eyes, and the darkness behind his eyelids was not empty. It was filled with images. Nowing steady, knowing eyes, the glint of light on his cleaver, the impossibly pure white of the scarf against the dirty canvas of his pack. He saw Marco's face, not as it was in life, laughing, confident, but as it was in the last moment, a mask of confusion and betrayal. A sound from the corner of the room snapped his eyes open. A soft, dragging scrape. He sat bolt upright, his body instantly rigid. He strained his ears, listening over the howl of the wind and the frantic pounding of his own heart. Silence. It was nothing. It was the wind. It was a mouse in the walls. It was his own mind, frayed and unraveling. He lay back down, his fists clenched at his sides. He would not give in to this. He was Julian Finch. He was smarter than this. He was in control. Scrape, thump. It came from the pack. He was on his feet in an instant, backing away until his shoulders hit the cold stone wall of the far side of the room. He stared at the dark, hulking shape in the corner. It was inanimate. A bag of canvas, nylon, and dead organic matter. It could not move. But he had heard it, a distinct internal shifting, as if the contents were settling. "This is not real," he whispered to the empty room, his voice a dry rasp. "This is the altitude, hypoxia, auditory hallucinations." He listed the clinical terms like a prayer, a ward against the encroaching madness. He forced himself to take a step, then another, until he was standing over the pack. He reached out a trembling hand, then snatched it back. What if he touched it and felt something move inside? The thought was so vile, so terrifying, it almost made him gag. He remembered the Porter Dawa's story of the trekker who saw a faceless man, the folklore of the Rawling, the animated corpse. Pema's words came back to him. If your spirit is full of ghosts, you see ghosts. His spirit was not just full of ghosts. He was carrying one on his back. He had to know. The uncertainty was worse than any reality. With fumbling, clumsy fingers, he began to unbuckle the straps. His breath hitched in his throat. The smell hit him first, faint but unmistakable. The cold had preserved the flesh, but it had not eliminated the smell. A sweet, coppery, sickly odor. The smell of a butcher's shop left uncleaned. He peeled back the main flap. The smaller, tightly cinched canvas bags were arranged just as he had packed them. He reached in, his fingers brushing against the cold, stiff fabric. He touched the largest sack, the one containing the torso. It was solid, unmoving. He prodded the smaller bags, limbs, solid, cold, dead. Relief washed over him, so potent it left him weak-kneed. It was his mind. It was all in his mind. He was about to close the pack when his fingers brushed against the bundle at the very bottom, cushioned by the sleeping bag. The head. And as he touched it, he felt it. a definite, subtle vibration. He froze, his hand still on the canvas. It was not a movement, it was a tremor, a low-frequency thrum that seemed to travel up his arm and into his chest. It felt like a purr, like the deep, resonant hum of the monks chanting, but wrong, twisted, coming from inside the bag. He snatched his hand away as if burned, scrambling back, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He stared at the pack, at the source of that impossible vibration. The humming stopped. The silence that rushed in was more terrifying than the sound itself. Was it real? Had he imagined it? The physical sensation had been undeniable. He could still feel the phantom vibration in his fingertips. The unquiet dead. Marco was not resting. He was resonating. Resonating with the monastery, with the chanting, with the sacred energy of the mountain he was about to defile. A floorboard creaked in the corridor outside his door. Julian's blood turned to ice. He flattened himself against the wall, his eyes glued to the thick wooden door. A shadow blotted out the sliver of light at the bottom. Someone was standing there, listening. Had they heard his cry? He held his breath, praying they would move on. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The shadow remained. Who was it? Tenzin, his suspicions finally driving him to investigate, Nawang drawn by some unholy instinct. The silence was absolute, save for the wind. Then the shadow was gone. Julian waited for what felt like an hour before he dared to move. He crept to the door and pressed his ear against the cold wood. Nothing. He peered through a tiny crack near the hinge. The corridor was empty. He stumbled back to his cot and collapsed, pulling the thin blanket over his head like a terrified child. He had lost control. The world was no longer behaving according to the rational, physical laws he had always trusted. The body in his pack was no longer just cargo. It was a cursed object, a focus of malevolent energy. And his own mind was the battleground. He did not sleep again. He simply waited for the dawn, listening for the humming to start again, his sanity fraying with every gust of wind. Chapter 9. Preparations on the Roof of the World. Dawn arrived not as a gentle light, but as a stark, gray illumination that offered no warmth. Julian felt hollowed out, scoured by fear and sleeplessness. He moved like an automaton, forcing himself through the motions of preparing for the final ascent. He packed the few items he had removed from his bag, his hands avoiding the deeper contents. He did not dare to check if the humming had returned. He did not want to know. He draped the white kata lakpa had given him around his neck. Against his dark jacket, it looked like a noose. The monastery was a hive of solemn activity. Nawang and Tenzin were already with Sanam's body, performing the final private rituals. Julian stayed away, lurking in the courtyard, watching the sky. It was a hard, metallic blue. The air was so thin it felt sharp in his throat. Lakpa found him there. She did not look at him with suspicion, only with a shared sense of gravity. "It is time," she said. She touched the kata at his neck. "May it keep you safe." The simple, genuine gesture was like a physical blow. Julian could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The depth of his deception felt bottomless. He was taking her blessing, her family's grief, her culture's most sacred rite, and twisting it into a tool for his own squalid purposes. He shouldered his pack. The weight was familiar, but today it felt different. It felt active, malign. He settled the straps, his face a mask of grim determination. He would not fail now. He was too close. The procession left the monastery in single file. Nawang and Tenzin went first, carrying Sanam's body, which was now tightly wrapped in white cloth and bound to a simple wooden frame. It looked small, dignified. Pema and Lakpa followed, their heads bowed, murmuring prayers. Then came Julian and finally Dawa, the porter, bringing up the rear. The two mastiffs, Kala and Berev, did not follow. They stood at the gate, watching Julian go, a low rumble in their chests. The path to the sky burial site was not a path at all. It was a steep, grueling scramble over loose rock and patches of treacherous ice. The world fell away below them into a dizzying expanse of valleys and lesser peaks. They were climbing to the roof of the world. The air was a knife. Every breath was a conscious effort. Julian's lungs burned. His legs were leaden. The pack was an instrument of torture, its weight seeking to pull him backward, to send him tumbling into the abyss. He focused on the boots of Lakpo in front of him, making them his entire world. Left foot, right foot, breathe. He was dizzy, his vision tunneling at the edges. He stumbled. His foot slipped on a patch of black ice and he went down hard on one knee. The pack, with its terrible momentum, swung sideways, threatening to pull him over the edge. Kenji. Tenzin and Dawa were there in an instant. Tenzin, moving with a speed and agility that belied his stocky frame, grabbed the top of Julian's pack to steady him. For one heart-stopping, eternal second, Tenzin held the weight of it. The weight of his father and the weight of the man on Julian's back. Tenzin's hand was inches from the top of the main compartment, where the canvas was stained with a faint, dark smudge Julian had missed in his cleaning. Tenzin's expression was unreadable, but his eyes narrowed. He looked from the pack to Julian's pale, sweat-streaked face. He held the weight for a moment longer than necessary, a silent, physical question. "It is heavier than any books, Kenji," Tenzin said, his voice low and flat. He helped Julian to his feet and then released the pack, wiping his hand on his trousers as if he had touched something unclean. The moment passed. The procession continued, but something had shifted. Tenzin's suspicion was no longer a vague feeling. It had become a physical reality. He had felt the weight. He knew. He might not have the words for it, he might not comprehend the truth, but he knew that what Julian carried was not right. An hour later they arrived. The plateau was a shock. It was a desolate, windswept expanse of flat, gray rock at the apex of the mountain, surrounded on all sides by the sky. The wind was a constant physical presence, tearing at their clothes, trying to push them from the summit. The ground was not clean. It was littered with the remnants of past ceremonies, splinters of bone, bleached white by the sun and wind. They crunched underfoot like gravel. And the sky was not empty. Dark shapes circled high above, soaring on the updrafts with effortless grace. Vultures, they were already gathering, dozens of them. They were patient, ancient. They were waiting. The family gathered around a large, flat rock at the center of the plateau. Nawang and Tenzin gently lowered Sanam's body onto it. The final moments had begun, and Julian knew he had only a short time to complete his own obscene ritual before all eyes turned to the sky. Chapter 10. The Gathering. The air on the plateau was thin and sharp as glass. It scoured the throat with every breath. Julian felt light-headed, detached, as if he were watching himself from a great distance. The family formed a tight, sorrowful circle around Sanam's body. Pema was chanting softly, her voice nearly lost in the ceaseless wind. Lakpa stood with her hands pressed together, her eyes closed, tears freezing on her cheeks. Tenzin stood like a stone sentinel, his gaze fixed on his father's shrouded form. Nawang was now at the center of it all. He began the final rite, his movements economical and precise. He unwrapped the outer layers of cloth, his actions full of a reverence that made Julian's skin crawl with self-loathing. This was a sacred space, a sacred act, and he was a festering sore upon it. This was his chance. The family's attention was entirely focused on Nawang and Sanam. Julian had to move now. He needed to find a place for his own grim offerings. His plan was simple. He would not place them at the center. He would distribute the canvas bags around the periphery of the plateau, behind rocks and in crevices as if they were merely discarded gear. The birds, with their keen senses, would find them. The evidence would be consumed, scattered, returned to the elements. He approached Tenzin, his heart a frantic drum. "Tenzin-san," he said, his voice thin in the wind. My equipment. To capture the acoustics of the wind, I must place the microphones away from the central area to get a clean recording." Tenzin did not look at him. He kept his eyes on his father. "Do what you must," he said, his voice flat and dismissive. It was the permission Julian needed. He backed away from the small group, moving towards the edge of the plateau. The pack on his back felt like a magnet, drawing the attention of the sky. He scrambled behind a large, jagged outcrop of rock that offered a sliver of concealment. His hands were clumsy, numb with cold and adrenaline. He fumbled with the straps of his pack, his fingers feeling like thick, useless sausages. He looked up. The circling vultures were descending, their flight paths tightening. They were not yet landing, but their shadows, huge and predatory, swept across the stony ground. And then he saw it. Perched on the highest point of the rock formation opposite him, aloof from the circling flock, was a single, massive vulture. It was larger than the others, its feathers darker, its bald head a pale, angry red. Across its beak ran a jagged white scar, a mark of old battles. It was the scarred one. It was not circling. It was not looking at Sanam's body. It was watching him. Its dark, intelligent eye was fixed on Julian with an unnerving, predatory stillness. It knew. The animal knew. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He ducked lower behind the rock, his back scraping against the rough stone. He had to hurry. He pulled the first, smallest canvas bag from his pack. It contained one of Marco's arms. The weight was dense, compact. He shoved it deep into a crevice between two rocks, covering the opening with smaller stones. One piece down. He straightened up, his eyes darting back to the ceremony. Nawang was working with his knives now. The family had turned their backs, a traditional act of respect, facing away from the physical reality of the dissection. This was his moment. All eyes were averted. He pulled a second bag from his pack. He was reaching for a third when he saw Nawang. The Rajiapa had stopped his work. His hand, holding a long, curved knife, was still. He had not turned around, but his head was cocked slightly, as if listening to something other than the wind. He slowly lifted his gaze from the body before him, not towards the sky, but straight across the plateau, straight towards Julian's hiding place. Nowang could not see him. The rock was in the way, but his focus was absolute, a predator sensing a disturbance in its territory. He was sensing the profanity, the sacrilege, the presence of another unhallowed corpse in his sacred workspace. Julian froze, a canvas sack clutched in his hand. He was caught between two gazes, the intelligent, unblinking eye of the alpha vulture on the rock above, and the uncanny, intuitive focus of the Rajiapa across the plateau. The ceremony had paused. The wind howled, carrying with it the scent of blood and cold stone. The circling vultures dipped lower, their great wings beating against the thin air, waiting for the invitation to descend. And Julian stood trapped in the heart of it all, a profanity about to be exposed, with the evidence of his crime in his hand and nowhere left to hide. Chapter 11. The Unseen Offering. The moment stretched, thin and taut as a wire. Nawang stood motionless, a still point in the howling wind, his head tilted as if listening to a frequency only he could perceive. Julian remained frozen behind his rock, the canvas bag containing Marco's other arm clutched in his fist. He was pinned, a specimen under the dual microscope of Nawang's intuition and the scarred one's avian gaze. Then Lakpa made a small, choked sound, a sob stolen by the wind. The sound broke the spell. Nawang's focus returned to the task before him, to the family whose grief was his immediate responsibility. He bent his head once more and resumed his work, his knife moving with a fluid, practiced grace. The release of tension was so abrupt it made Julian's knees weak. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had been granted another moment, a final chance. He could not afford to waste it. He worked with a frantic, desperate energy. He did not have time for careful concealment. He pulled the remaining bags from his pack, his hands clumsy and shaking. He shoved them into any crevice he could find behind rocks under ledges. He worked like a panicked animal burying its hoard, his movements jerky and inefficient. The last piece was the head. He hesitated, the bag feeling unnaturally heavy, the memory of its strange vibration a cold ghost in his hand. He thrust it deep into a dark fissure at the base of the outcrop, jamming it in with a ferocity born of terror. His pack was empty. The physical weight was gone, but it was replaced by a different kind of burden, a light-headed, untethered feeling. He was now just a man in a jacket, an empty fraud. He scattered a few pieces of his recording equipment, a useless microphone, a coil of cable nearby to complete the illusion. He looked up. The scarred one had not moved. It still watched him, its head cocked, its ancient eye seeming to hold a kind of cold, reptilian intelligence. It had seen everything. Julian stumbled back towards the center of the plateau, trying to compose his features into a mask of solemn respect. He needed to rejoin the group, to become Kenji the student once more. But as he stepped out from behind the rock, his foot caught on something. He looked down. It was a bone. A human femur, old and bleached a stark white, half buried in the scree. And lying next to it, almost invisible against the gray stone, was something else. A small, turquoise amulet on a leather thong. Julian's heart stopped. It was Marco's. the one he had taken as a trophy and then, in a fit of paranoia at the monastery, had discarded, thinking he had thrown it down a latrine. He must have missed. It must have fallen into his cuff or a pocket and then dropped here. An impossible, damning piece of evidence, lying in plain sight. He bent to snatch it up, but a voice cut through the wind. "Kenji." It was Tenzin. He stood not 20 feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. He was no longer watching the ceremony. He was watching Julian. His eyes were cold slits of fury. "What did you find?" Tenzin asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Julian straightened up slowly, his hand empty. He had not been fast enough. He was certain Tenzin had seen it. "Nothing," Julian said, his voice a dry crackle. "Just an interesting rock." "A rock," Tenzin repeated, his disbelief a palpable force. He took a step closer. "You have been busy hiding your equipment. Are you finished with your research?" "Yes," Julian managed. "The microphones are placed." Nawang had completed his work. He stepped back from the central stone, his knives wiped clean. He gave a slight nod to the family. It was the signal. The offering was ready. The family turned one by one to face the sky. Nawang looked across the plateau, his gaze meeting Julian's. There was no longer any question in his eyes. There was only a grave, terrible certainty. He knew. Julian did not know how, but the Rajiapa knew. And then the birds descended. It was not a gradual arrival. It was a sudden, silent rush. One moment the sky was full of circling shapes, the next the plateau was alive with them. The great Himalayan griffins landed with a soft, heavy thud of feathers and flesh, their powerful legs absorbing the impact. They did not squabble or shriek. They moved with a solemn purpose, forming a living, shifting circle around the offering on the stone. The family watched, their faces upturned. This was the moment of acceptance, the moment the sky took their loved one. But the vultures did not move towards the body. They stood in their ring, their heads turning, their dark eyes scanning the plateau. A low, uneasy rustling passed through the flock. They were hesitant, confused. They looked at the central stone, then away towards the periphery, towards the places where Julian had hidden his grim parcels. The scarred one from its high perch let out a single harsh cry. It was not a call to feast. It was a cry of warning, of agitation. The flock shifted. A few birds took a hesitant step towards Sanam's body, then stopped, pulling back as if repelled by an invisible wall. They would not touch it. A low gasp came from Lakpa. "They are not taking him." Pema began to chant louder, her voice laced with a desperate urgency. This was the ultimate shame, the ultimate sign of a cursed soul or a polluted rite, for the vultures to refuse the offering. Tenzin's gaze snapped from the birds to Julian, his face a mask of dawning horror and rage. He understood. He finally understood. "What have you done?" he breathed, the words torn from his throat. "What did you bring to this place?" And then the impossible happened. A single vulture, a smaller one near the edge of the flock, broke from the circle. But it did not fly away. It turned and began to walk with a strange, deliberate gait towards the rock formation where Julian had been hiding. Another followed, then a third. They were ignoring the sanctified offering. They were ignoring the body prepared with reverence and prayer. They were moving towards the unseen, the profane. They were moving towards Marco. Chapter 12. A Feast of Lies. The world seemed to shrink to the space of the plateau. The wind, the sky, the distant peaks, all faded into an indistinct backdrop for the horror unfolding. The small group of vultures moved with an unnerving purpose, their bald heads low to the ground. They bypassed the central stone completely, their actions a stark, public rejection of the holy rite. "They will not touch him," Pema wailed, her voice cracking with despair. She sank to her knees, her faith confronted with an undeniable sacrilege. Lakpa rushed to her mother's side, her face pale with shock and confusion. "Why, Tenzin, why?" But Tenzin was no longer looking at his family. His eyes, burning with a cold, murderous fire, were locked on Julian. He took a step forward, then another. "You," he snarled, "this is your doing." Nawang stood by the central stone, his face grim. He watched the renegade vultures, his expression that of a master craftsman whose workshop has been defiled. He looked at Sanam's body, untouched and rejected, and then his gaze followed the birds. He, too, understood. The small group of vultures reached the rock formation at the edge of the plateau. One of them, with a powerful thrust of its beak and claws, tore away the loose stones Julian had piled in the crevice. It pulled out the canvas bag. The fabric was dark, stained. The bird tore at it with its hooked beak, ripping it open with a savage efficiency. A human arm, pale and rigid, tumbled out onto the stones. A collective gasp went through the family. Lakpa screamed, a thin, piercing sound of pure horror. Pema stared, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond grief. "Tenzin," Lakpa whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is that?" But Tenzin knew. His memory flew back to Gideon Hayes, the American trekker, to the story of the missing Italian photographer, to the evasions and the lies, to the impossible weight of the pack he had helped lift. It all coalesced into a single, monstrous truth. "He brought a body," Tenzin roared, his voice cracking with rage and disbelief. "He brought a murdered man to my father's sky." He lunged at Julian. Julian stumbled back, his mind a maelstrom of panic. The plan was in ruins. The performance was over. There was only the raw, brutal reality of his exposure. He turned to run, but there was nowhere to go. The edge of the plateau and a 2,000-foot drop was just behind him. Tenzin was on him in an instant, his powerful hands seizing the front of Julian's jacket. He lifted Julian from his feet, his face contorted with a grief that had curdled into pure violence. "You have damned my father's soul," he screamed, shaking Julian like a rag doll. More vultures were moving now, drawn by the scent of the first uncovered piece. They converged on the outcrop, tearing at the other bags, revealing their gruesome contents with a grim, businesslike hunger. It was a feast of lies, a banquet of profanity. Nawang strode forward, his face a thundercloud. He grabbed Tenzin's shoulder. "Tenzin, stop. This is not the way." "He must pay," Tenzin bellowed, his knuckles white where he gripped Julian's coat. "Justice is for the valley," Nawang said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "This is the mountain. The mountain will deliver its own judgment." As if summoned by his words, the scarred one moved. It launched itself from its high perch, its massive wings catching the wind. But it did not join the frenzy at the rocks. It soared over their heads, its shadow passing over them like a final verdict. It circled once, twice, and then it landed, not by the butchered remains of Marco, but on the central stone, next to the untouched body of Sanam. The great bird stood there, a king claiming his throne. It lowered its head, and with a single, deliberate motion, it tore at the shroud covering Sanam's body. A hush fell over the plateau, even the wind seeming to hold its breath. The flock of vultures at the rock stopped their feeding. One by one they turned their heads, their bloody beaks pointing towards the central stone. The scarred one had made its choice. It had accepted the offering. It was an act of grace, an act of pity, or perhaps an act of condemnation, a final statement on which soul was worthy and which was profane. As the other vultures began to abandon their gruesome meal and move towards the sanctified one, Nawang's grip tightened on Tenzin's shoulder. "Do you see? Your father's journey begins. His generosity is accepted. Do not dishonor it with vengeance here." Tenzin's rage did not vanish, but the violent fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a profound, agonizing sorrow. He released his grip on Julian, shoving him backward. Julian stumbled and fell hard on the stony ground. He landed inches from the turquoise amulet. He lay there gasping for air, watching as the flock of vultures, led by their scarred king, began the ancient, sacred work of returning a soul to the sky. They had rejected his lie. They had spurned his meticulous, sociopathic crime. He had failed. In the most public and spiritually devastating way possible, he had failed. Tenzin stood over him, his shadow a dark accusation. "When they are finished," he said, his voice cold as the stone beneath them, "we will take you down, and you will tell the world what you have done." Julian looked from Tenzin's face to Nawang's, then to Lakpa's, which was wet with tears of both grief and horror. There was no escape. The performance was over. The only thing left was the consequence. Chapter 13. The Judgment of the Mountain. The descent was a silent parade of shame. Tenzin walked directly in front of Julian, his broad back a wall of rigid fury. Nawang walked behind, his presence a heavy, silent judgment. They did not speak to him. They did not look at him. They herded him down the mountain like a diseased animal, a pollutant being removed from a sacred space. The sky burial site was left behind. The vultures would finish their work. The wind would scour the stones. But the memory of the desecration would remain, a permanent stain on the holy ground. Julian had not just murdered a man. He had murdered a family's peace, violated a culture's faith. They reached the monastery as dusk was painting the peaks in shades of bruised purple. The two mastiffs, Kala and Barav, were waiting at the gate. They did not growl. They did not move. They simply watched him pass, their ancient eyes holding a kind of grim satisfaction. He was a prisoner now, his status confirmed. They did not put him in his old cell. Tenzin took him to a small, windowless storage room in the monastery's coldest corner. The air was frigid and smelled of damp stone and yak butter. There was nothing inside but a single wooden bench. Tenzin shoved him into the room. "You will wait here," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. He slid the heavy wooden bolt on the outside of the door, the sound a final, definitive slam. Julian was left in absolute darkness. The silence was total, a suffocating blanket. His grand plan, his perfect crime, his artistic statement, it had all ended here, in a cold, dark room, waiting for a justice he could not escape. He did not know how long he sat there. Time ceased to have meaning. Hours bled into one another. He replayed the events on the plateau over and over in his mind. The look on Lakpa's face, the raw hatred in Tenzin's eyes, the profound, quiet disappointment on Nawang's, and the unwavering, intelligent gaze of the scarred vulture. He had believed himself to be a predator, a superior intellect moving unseen among lesser beings. But on the mountain he was nothing. His cleverness was a child's toy in the face of ancient traditions and the raw power of nature. The mountain itself seemed to have a consciousness, a will. It had used the birds, the family, even his own carelessness with the amulet to expose him. At some point the bolt was drawn back. The door opened, revealing Lama Kelsang. He held a small butter lamp, its single flame casting long, dancing shadows. He did not look angry. He looked tired and immeasurably sad. "Your name is not Kenji," the Lama stated. "No," Julian whispered. His voice was a dry rasp. "Your spirit is full of ghosts," the Lama said, echoing Pema's words from what felt like a lifetime ago. "And you tried to make this holy place your graveyard. You do not fear the gods. That is a dangerous way to live." "There are no gods," Julian said, the defiant, nihilistic words sounding weak and pathetic even to his own ears. The Lama smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "You are wrong. There are gods and there are demons. They are not in the sky, they are in here." He tapped his own chest. "You have fed your demon well, it is fat and strong, but it has made you its prisoner." The Lama placed the butter lamp on the floor. "Tenzin will take you to the police in the morning. Your journey is over." He turned to leave. "Wait," Julian said, a desperate, unfamiliar plea in his voice. "The body, the other one, what will happen to it?" Lama Kelsang paused in the doorway. "Nawang has gone back up," he said quietly. "He will gather the pieces, he will clean the stone, he will perform the rites. He will give that lost soul the generosity you denied him. He will give him a clean journey to the sky." The abbot looked at Julian, his eyes holding a universe of pity. "It is more than you deserve." The door closed and the bolt slid home. Julian was alone again, with only the flickering flame of the lamp for company. The light threw his shadow, huge and distorted, against the stone wall. It looked like a monster. He stared at the physical manifestation of the thing he had become. And for the first time since he had stood over Marco's body with an ice axe in his hand, Julian Finch began to weep. They were not tears of remorse. They were tears of failure. The tears of a fallen god, a dethroned king, alone in the dark with his own empty, hollow soul. Chapter 14. A Walk Through the Valley. The morning was a painful birth. The bolt on Julian's door was drawn back not by a gentle Lama, but by Tenzin. His face was set like granite, his eyes holding the cold, dead light of a winter dawn. He carried a length of rope. "Put your hands out," Tenzin commanded. Julian obeyed. Tenzin bound his wrists tightly, expertly. The rough rope bit into his skin. He was now officially a prisoner, his humiliation complete. "We walk," Tenzin said. The walk from the monastery was the reverse of his ascent, a pilgrimage into hell instead of towards it. Lakpa and Pema were nowhere to be seen. Julian was glad. He could not have borne their gaze. As they passed through the monastery gate, he saw Nawang. The Rajiapa was sitting on the low stone wall cleaning a set of knives. They were not the same knives as before. These were smaller, more intricate. They looked clean. Nawang did not look up as they passed, but Julian felt his presence like a physical weight. The compassionate man who had cleaned up his mess. The journey down the mountain was slow. Tenzin set a grueling pace, forcing Julian, with his hands bound, to stumble and slide on the treacherous path. He fell several times, cutting his knees, bruising his ribs. Tenzin would haul him to his feet without a word and push him onward. The silence was a form of torture, a thick, heavy blanket of condemnation. Villages they had passed on the way up were now gauntlets of shame. News traveled faster than a storm front in these mountains. The story of the defiled ceremony of the foreigner who brought a hidden body to the holy site had spread like a virus. Faces peered from doorways. Children stopped their games to stare. The looks were not of curiosity, but of a deep, collective revulsion. He was an outcast, an untouchable, the man who had angered the mountain. They stopped at the tea house in Gyaru. It was almost empty now. The owner, a woman who had smiled at him on the way up, now refused to look at him. She served Tenzin a cup of tea but brought nothing for Julian. He sat at the table, his wrists bound, dying of thirst, enduring the silent judgment of the room. It was in Manning that the true weight of his actions became manifest. As they entered the village, a small crowd gathered. Dawa, the cheerful porter, was there. His face was no longer smiling. It was a mask of betrayal and anger. "He lied to us," Dawa shouted, his voice shaking. "He walked with Sanam's body, he ate with his family, and all the while, he could not finish." He spat on the ground at Julian's feet. The crowd grew, their murmurs swelling into a low, angry hum. They pressed in, their faces a collage of fury. Julian saw Gideon Hayes, the American, on the edge of the crowd, his face pale with shock. He had likely been the one to confirm Marco's identity. Tenzin did not stop. He plowed through the crowd, dragging Julian behind him. A stone flew past Julian's head. Another struck him in the back. He flinched but kept moving. He was a pariah, a scapegoat for a communal wound. He had brought a darkness to their valley that would not be easily cleansed. They spent the night in a locked room at the local police post, a small, two-room building run by a single, weary officer. The officer looked at Julian with a kind of baffled disgust. He had dealt with drunk trekkers and petty theft. He had never seen anything like this. Tenzin spoke with the officer in low, rapid tones. He handed him Marco's amulet, which he must have picked up from the plateau. The turquoise stone, a final piece of evidence, lay on the desk between them, a small, vibrant accusation. That night Julian lay on the floor of the holding cell, the angry shouts of the village fading to a dull murmur. He was no longer on the mountain. He was back in the world of men, of laws, of consequences. The abstract spiritual judgment of the mountain was being replaced by the concrete bureaucratic process of human justice, and he knew with a chilling certainty that it would be a far less merciful judge. The mountain had cast him out. The world of men was about to swallow him whole. Chapter 15. The Weight of a Name. The helicopter arrived 2 days later. It was a noisy, intrusive machine, its rotors beating the thin mountain air into submission. It landed in a swirl of dust and prayer flags in a field outside Manning. This was the end of the line, the end of the climb, the end of the descent. From here on, his journey would be one of sterile corridors, locked doors, and the slow, grinding wheels of international jurisprudence. Two Nepalese police officers, their uniforms crisp and official against the rugged backdrop, escorted him from the holding cell. The entire village seemed to have turned out to watch. They were silent now, their anger having cooled into a hard, unforgiving stare. He saw Lakpa in the crowd. She was standing beside Pema, her face a heartbreaking canvas of grief. She was not looking at him with hatred. She was looking at him with a kind of profound, devastating pity, as if he were the most pitiable creature she had ever seen. That look was worse than any stone, any curse. Tenzin was there. He spoke with the lead officer, handing over a small, formal-looking bundle. Julian knew what it was, the tools from his pack. The knives, the saw, the cleaver. Nawang must have gathered them from his cell. The instruments of his grand design, now exhibits for the prosecution. As they led him towards the helicopter, Tenzin stepped in front of him. He did not look at Julian. He looked at the officers. "His name," Tenzin said, his voice clear and strong, carrying over the idling chop of the rotors. "The man he killed. His name was Marco Benini. He was a photographer from Italy. He liked to laugh. He trusted a stranger. His name must be said." The words were not for the police. They were for the village, for the mountain, for the universe. It was a final act of restoration, an insistence that Marco was not just a collection of parts, not just evidence in a crime, but a man with a name. Julian was pushed into the helicopter. The door slid shut, cutting him off from the world he had so brutally invaded. The engine roared and the machine lifted off the ground. The village of Manning, the monastery, the great white peaks of the Annapurna range, they all shrank below him. He saw the high plateau, a tiny gray speck on the roof of the world, a place he had chosen for its isolation, its silence, a place that had become the loudest, most crowded, most damning courtroom in the world. The flight to Kathmandu was a blur. He was handed over to consular officials, to detectives, to lawyers. He was no longer Julian Finch, the architect of a perfect crime. He was a case file, a diplomatic incident, a murderer. In the end, there was no grand trial. The evidence was overwhelming. His confession was flat, emotionless, a simple recitation of the facts. He was sentenced in a quiet, foreign courtroom. Life. In a prison far from the snow and the wind and the silence. He spends his days in a concrete box. There are no mountains here, no sky, only walls. He does not speak of his art, of his philosophy. Those things died on the mountain. They were revealed as the hollow, pathetic delusions of a sick mind. He is not haunted by the ghost of Marco. He is not haunted by the terror of the plateau. He is haunted by something far quieter. He is haunted by the look in Lakpa's eyes. He is haunted by the gentle dignity with which Nawang cleaned up his filth. He is haunted by the memory of a name, spoken with love and fury into the thin, cold air. Sometimes at night when the prison is quiet, he can almost hear the wind. He can almost feel the weight of the pack on his shoulders. He is no longer Julian Finch, the man who wanted to create a perfect, silent crime. He is just a man in a box, a man who learned too late that some places are not empty, some silences are not silent, and that every action, no matter how remote, has a weight that must be carried forever. Chapter 16. The Concrete Sky. 15 years. He measured the time not in days or months, but in the slow erosion of the concrete floor beneath his cot, the gradual fading of a water stain on the ceiling, the number of winter coughs that echoed down the cell block. The prison was a mountain of a different sort, one made of steel and stone and the compressed misery of 1,000 lives. It was a vertical, sterile, unchanging landscape. There was no wind here, only the stale, recycled air pushed through vents, humming a low, monotonous drone that was a pale, pathetic echo of the monk's chant. Julian Finch no longer resembled the meticulous, arrogant man who had planned a masterpiece of transgression. His hair was thin and gray, his face was gaunt, and his eyes, which had once held a cold, analytical fire, were now dull and recessed. The institution had done its work. It had ground him down, stripped him of his affectations, and left only the raw, obsessive core of his personality. He had once obsessed over maps and weather patterns. Now he obsessed over the precise number of cracks in his ceiling, 112, the schedule of the guards' footsteps, the life cycle of the spiders that spun their webs in the corner of his cell. He had been diagnosed: antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic traits, a profound lack of empathy. The labels were attached to his file like the tags on his prison uniform. They were neat, clinical explanations for the thing he had done, but Julian knew they were incomplete. They were words from the valley. They did not speak of the mountain. The mountain had not left him. It was a constant, quiet presence in the back of his mind. Sometimes, when the prison was deep in its nighttime silence, he would hear it. The scrape of a guard's boot on the polished floor would become the scrape of his own boots on loose scree. The low hum of the electrical systems would deepen into the impossible, resonant vibration he had felt from the bag containing Marco's head. The hiss of the radiator in winter was the worst. It was the wind on the plateau, a sound that promised both liberation and judgment. He never spoke of these things. To speak of them would be to admit madness, to give the prison psychologists more labels for their files. He kept his haunting private. It was the only thing that was truly his. He spent his days in the prison library, not reading fiction. He had lost all taste for invention, but poring over old atlases and geology textbooks. He traced the contours of the Annapurna Massif with a trembling finger, his eyes lingering on the spot he had pinpointed as the sky burial site. He was trying to understand it, to rationalize it, to reduce it to tectonic plates and barometric pressure, and the predictable migration patterns of Gyps Himalayensis. He was trying to convince himself that what had happened there was not a judgment, but a series of logical, explainable events. A wary alpha bird, a suspicious man's intuition, a piece of bad luck with an amulet. But the explanation always fell apart. It could not account for the weight of Nawang's gaze. It could not explain the absolute certainty he had felt when the flock rejected his offering. It could not explain the feeling that the mountain itself had been watching him, weighing him, and finding him wanting. One Tuesday, a guard slid a letter through the slot in his cell door. It was a rare event. His parents were long dead. He had no other connections. The envelope was plain, official, with foreign stamps. It was from the Italian Ministry of Justice. He sat on his cot and opened it with numb fingers. The letter was brief, formal, written in sterile legal language. It was a notification. It informed him, as the convicted party in the case, that following years of diplomatic requests, the partial remains of Marco Benini, recovered from the Annapurna Conservation Area, had been successfully repatriated to Italy. They had been interred in his family's plot in a small cemetery overlooking Lake Como. The case, from their perspective, was now administratively closed. Julian read the letter once, then twice. He folded it neatly and placed it on the small shelf next to his cot. Marco was gone from the mountain. He had gone home. He had been given a box and buried in the ground, the very thing Nawang had called a selfish lie. Yet in this context it felt like a final, quiet victory. Marco's name had been restored, his body had been reclaimed by his people, his memory was now anchored to a place of beauty and peace. His story had an ending. Julian's story was a perpetual present tense. He was the one left on the mountain. His concrete cell had become the plateau. That night he could not quiet the sounds. The radiator hissed Marco's name. The generator hummed with the energy of the unquiet dead. He got up and went to the small, barred window of his cell. It looked out onto a brick wall, and if he pressed his face to the bars and craned his neck, a small, dirty rectangle of city sky, stained orange by the lights of civilization. A pigeon was perched on the ledge outside his window. It was a common city bird, mottled gray and iridescent green. It watched him with its bright, unblinking eye. Julian stared back. He saw the dirty pigeon, but his mind superimposed another image over it. A larger bird, a scarred beak, an ancient, intelligent gaze that held the cold, clear light of the roof of the world. He thought of his own death, the inevitable, mundane end that would come to him in this box. There would be no ceremony, no sacred ground, no final act of generosity. His body, the vessel of his great, failed ambition, would be handled by other prisoners, by overworked coroners. It would be a problem of disposal, noted on a form, filed away. It would be given to the earth or the fire without reverence, without meaning. He who had perverted a sacred rite of dispersal was condemned to a meaningless end, forever trapped by the ground. He pressed his forehead against the cold steel bars. The pigeon cooed, a soft, indifferent sound, and flew away. Julian watched it go, a dark shape against the polluted orange glow. He was left staring at his own concrete sky, a prisoner not just of the state, but of the mountain he could never leave. He would stand at this window, night after night, waiting for a judgment that had already been delivered, carrying a weight that would never be lifted. The end.